That was the entertainment industry's dirty secret, whispered about but never fully exposed until the trial. Two storms, two sets of victims, two empires built on silence. But these emails, they're showing people something else. They're showing patterns, they're showing language similarities, they're showing similar social circles, they're showing similar logistics teams, similar travel routines, similar don't ask questions staff. One insider called it two different men using the same playbook. On paper, Diddy's story and Epstein's story were supposed to be totally separate scandals. Different industries, different victims, different methods. Epstein's nightmare ended in 2019 when he was found in his Manhattan cell. Diddy's began unraveling publicly after the 2024 indictment, accusing him of kidnapping, arson, witness intimidation, secret recordings, and freak-offs that lasted days at a time. For years, Epstein's private island and those flight logs were the stuff of conspiracy legends. And Diddy's freak-off allegations?
Ellen DeGeneres, Jeffrey Epstein, Sean Diddy Combs. Three names, three completely different industries, three very different public images. And yet, over and over again, these names keep resurfacing in the same conversations. Not because of one shared accusation, not because of a single confirmed document, but because when you step back and look closely, the same pattern keeps repeating. A pattern of power, a pattern of proximity, and a pattern of silence. Once you start noticing it, it becomes hard to ignore. Before we go any further, pause for a moment and think about this. When powerful figures from totally separate worlds keep appearing around controversy at the same time, do you see coincidence, or do you think patterns themselves deserve scrutiny? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're here for breakdowns that go beyond surface-level headlines, make sure you're subscribed because this story doesn't move in straight lines. It deepens. Now let's slow everything down. What's happening here isn't one story. It's a sequence. And sequences don't feel dangerous at first until you realize how long they've been building. Start with Ellen. For years, Ellen DeGeneres symbolized something very specific to the public. Safe, friendly, predictable. A daily presence built around humor, generosity, and comfort. That image didn't happen by accident. It was carefully shaped, consistently reinforced, and protected by repetition. And for a long time it worked perfectly. Then small cracks began to appear. Not one explosive revelation, but multiple quiet accounts. Stories from people who said the environment behind the scenes didn't match what viewers saw on screen. At first, those stories felt easy to dismiss. Every successful person attracts criticism, right? But over time, the volume mattered. And once enough similar stories surfaced, perception shifted. That shift is important. Because when perception changes, the past doesn't stay frozen. Old moments start to feel different. Clips that once seemed harmless suddenly feel uncomfortable. Jokes get reinterpreted. Silence becomes noticeable, not because new evidence appears, but because the frame changes. That's how narratives actually evolve. Now add Epstein. Epstein's story didn't just expose criminal behavior. It exposed structure. His name became symbolic of something larger, a reminder that power often moves socially long before it's ever challenged legally. His case forced the public to accept an uncomfortable reality. Proximity matters. Who you know matters. And for years, that proximity can operate without consequence. After Epstein, something changed permanently. People stopped believing that elite connections were meaningless. Social circles stopped feeling neutral. Being around powerful people became something worth questioning. Curiosity shifted into scrutiny, and once scrutiny becomes the default lens, it doesn't turn off easily. Now enter Diddy. For decades, stories about influence, control, and behind-the-scenes power circulated around him as industry talk. Exaggerations, rumors, things people whispered but rarely examined seriously. But when legal scrutiny enters the picture, context changes. Old stories don't disappear, they return, and this time they're viewed differently. What once sounded like mythology starts sounding like warning signs. This is where the convergence begins. Because when one powerful figure faces pressure, attention doesn't stay contained. People instinctively look sideways, who shared the same spaces, who overlapped socially, who appeared connected during moments that once felt insignificant. This isn't about proving guilt. It's about how human pattern recognition works. Once the brain sees collapse in one place, it scans for similar structures elsewhere. That's how Ellen, Epstein, and Diddy begin occupying the same mental space online. Not through official records, but through narrative gravity. Then timing amplifies everything. Stories don't resurface randomly. They tend to return when attention is already focused and skepticism is high. One headline opens the door. Then old footage gets reposted. Old interviews feel newly relevant. Casual remarks suddenly feel loaded. Moments that once passed quietly now feel important. This isn't accidental. This is how engagement ecosystems function. Platforms reward escalation. Calm explanations don't travel. Mystery does. When enough people ask the same question, why does this keep coming up? The narrative accelerates on its own. This is where the story starts to feel darker. Not because of new proof, but because of emotional convergence. Ellen's image fracture creates discomfort. Epstein's legacy creates distrust. Diddy's scrutiny creates curiosity. Together, they create the feeling that something larger is being revealed, even without confirmation. And that feeling is powerful. It makes people feel like they're watching a curtain slowly lift. Then silence enters the picture. Silence used to mean neutrality. Today, silence is often interpreted as strategy. When institutions don't address speculation directly, people assume calculation. Whether that assumption is fair or not becomes secondary. The perception alone reshapes the conversation. And once perception shifts, it rarely reverses. At this point, the story stops being about individuals and starts being about systems, about how images are built, how access is protected, how accountability often arrives late. That realization pushes people to reevaluate the past. Old footage feels heavier. Old praise feels strategic. Old associations feel permanent. Context becomes retroactive. Online communities accelerate this process. Someone reposts a clip with a question. Another person connects it to a different moment. Someone else loosely aligns events into a timeline. None of them claims certainty, but together they create coherence. And coherence feels like understanding. That's why the narrative keeps intensifying without new facts. Because what's growing isn't evidence. It's belief. Once a framework forms power, proximity, silence, time, new information doesn't need to prove itself. It only needs to fit. And when it fits, it's absorbed automatically. Anything that doesn't fit gets questioned instead. That's how narratives harden. And once they harden, they begin shaping how every new controversy is interpreted. A new powerful figure faces scrutiny, and the first question becomes familiar. Who else was in the room? This is the long shadow stories like this cast. And this is only the beginning of how this narrative unfolds. Once that shadow forms, it doesn't stay still. It stretches. And the reason it stretches is because people are no longer just reacting to information, they're reacting to a feeling. The feeling that something familiar is no longer simple, that the versions of reality they were comfortable with may have been incomplete. This is where the narrative quietly shifts. It stops being about individual moments and starts becoming about systems, about how power behaves when it's insulated, about how long influence can operate without being challenged, about how many warning signs can exist in plain sight before anyone takes them seriously. Because when people look back at Ellen's carefully maintained image, the discomfort isn't limited to her. It's about how an entire machine can protect an identity for years. Producers, networks, audiences, everyone plays a role in reinforcing what feels safe. And once that safety cracks, the question isn't just who knew. It's how did this last so long? When people look at Epstein, that question becomes even louder. His story taught the public that access can be normalized, even when it shouldn't be. That influence can disguise itself as legitimacy. That entire social ecosystems can exist for years before consequences arrive. And once that lesson is learned, it permanently alters how people interpret elite spaces. Now place Diddy back into that frame. Years of stories that once sounded exaggerated are suddenly revisited with fresh eyes. Not because they've been proven, but because the environment has changed. When scrutiny appears, context changes. The same words, the same clips, the same moments feel heavier simply because trust has already been damaged elsewhere. This is how unrelated narratives begin to feel connected. Not through evidence, but through structure. Another force driving this is timing. When multiple controversies surface within overlapping periods, the brain assumes meaning. Even if events are unrelated, proximity creates association. The mind doesn't wait for confirmation, it builds continuity. That's why people start mapping timelines, not official ones, but emotional ones. This happened around the same time as that. This resurfaced when that broke. This went quiet right when attention shifted. None of these observations prove anything on their own, but together they feel suggestive. And suggestion is powerful, especially online. Because online, silence doesn't pause a story, it feeds it. When institutions choose not to respond, the gap fills itself. People speculate, interpret, reconstruct. And once a reconstruction feels coherent, it spreads faster than any correction ever could. This is why attempts to dismiss these conversations often fail. Saying, "There's no evidence," doesn't calm the audience. In a climate shaped by delayed accountability, lack of evidence feels temporary, not reassuring. The assumption becomes that evidence exists somewhere unseen. That assumption keeps curiosity alive. Another layer deepening the story is reputational ripple. Once one figure is questioned, scrutiny spreads outward. Collaborators, associates, anyone who shared proximity gets re-examined. Old photos feel strategic. Old praise feels calculated. Neutral interactions begin to look deliberate. This isn't accusation, it's atmosphere. And atmosphere doesn't require facts to persist. What makes this phase especially intense is familiarity. These aren't obscure names. These are figures people have watched, listened to, and trusted for years. When familiarity collides with suspicion, the emotional response is stronger. It feels personal, like betrayal. That emotional reaction fuels engagement far more effectively than outrage ever could. People don't move on quickly from stories that challenge their understanding of the world. Another important shift happens here. Authority changes hands. Traditional gatekeepers lose influence. Collective interpretation takes over. People no longer wait for official timelines. They assemble their own narratives from fragments, clips, quotes, resurfaced headlines. And when those fragments align, even loosely, they feel convincing. This is how narratives become self-sustaining. They no longer need new revelations. They just need reinforcement. Each resurfacing strengthens the association. Each repetition makes the story feel older, more established, more known. Eventually, people forget where it started. They only know it exists. At this stage, the story isn't driven by discovery, it's driven by maintenance. People return to it not to learn something new, but to orient themselves, to confirm that their unease is shared. This is where the conversation subtly changes tone. It moves away from what happened and toward what else haven't we been told? And that question has no endpoint. It opens an infinite loop of suspicion, and infinite loops are perfect for sustained attention. Another reason the narrative refuses to settle is because it aligns with a broader cultural shift. Audiences have seen too many examples where polished stories unraveled years later. That history trains people to expect a second version, a messier version, one that feels more honest because it's imperfect. So when contradictions appear, they feel authentic. That's a dangerous inversion, but it's real. This is also where power dynamics become central. The focus moves from individual behavior to insulation. Who gets protected? Who gets questioned? Who benefits from doubt? Once those disparities are noticed, they're applied everywhere. In that environment, Ellen, Epstein, and Diddy don't need to be directly connected to feel symbolically linked. They represent similar positions within systems of access and influence. And once people see them that way, every new detail is filtered through that lens. That filtering effect is subtle but relentless. Neutral information begins to feel ominous. Silence feels strategic. Distance feels intentional. Even transparency can be read as damage control. There is no neutral move once trust erodes past a certain point. This is why the story keeps darkening without new facts. Darkness here isn't about severity, it's about inevitability. The feeling that whatever the full truth is, it will be worse than expected. And that feeling alone is enough to keep people watching. As long as that feeling exists, the narrative continues to widen, pulling in more moments, more names, more reinterpretations. Each addition makes the story feel heavier, even if nothing concrete changes. And that widening is exactly what gives the story its momentum. As that momentum builds, something subtle but important happens. The story stops being about any single person and starts becoming about expectation. Audiences begin to expect that there is always more beneath the surface, that whatever they're seeing publicly is only a fraction of the full picture. And once that expectation settles in, it reshapes how every new piece of information is received. This is where belief quietly takes over. Not belief in one claim or one theory, but belief in a structure. A structure where power rarely operates transparently, where influence protects itself, where accountability doesn't arrive immediately, but slowly, and often after damage has already been done. That belief doesn't require constant reinforcement, it feeds itself. You can see it in how people revisit the past. Old interviews get replayed not for what was said, but for what wasn't. Body language gets analyzed. Tone gets questioned. Moments that once felt ordinary now feel performative. And when people start interpreting behavior instead of statements, the story deepens automatically. Because interpretation has no ceiling. This is also where the narrative becomes resistant to correction. Even when new information appears that contradicts speculation, it often gets absorbed in a way that preserves the overall atmosphere. Instead of weakening the story, it becomes another layer. Another example of confusion. Another reason to doubt clarity. That's how uncertainty turns into permanence. Another factor keeping this alive is how easily separate conversations merge online. A discussion about media accountability blends into one about celebrity culture. That blends into power dynamics. That blends into silence. Before long, everything feels interconnected, even if it never was in a factual sense. And once that interconnection feels real, people stop separating categories. Legal issues, reputational shifts, cultural criticism, they all collapse into one narrative space. The distinctions that matter in reality don't matter as much in perception. This is why stories like this feel so heavy. They carry more than facts. They carry implication. And implication is emotionally potent. It allows the audience to fill in gaps themselves. And when people fill in gaps, they tend to do it in ways that confirm what they already suspect. That's confirmation bias at work. But in environments shaped by past betrayals and delayed accountability, confirmation bias feels less like bias and more like caution. People don't think they're being unfair, they think they're being realistic. They think they're finally seeing clearly. That sense of clarity, even if it's built on assumption, is comforting. It gives shape to unease. It explains why things feel off. And explanations, even incomplete ones, are easier to live with than ambiguity. This is why the story refuses to fade. Every time attention shifts elsewhere, it waits. Then something small pulls it back into focus. A resurfaced clip, a comment, a passing reference, and suddenly the entire framework snaps back into place. This snapback effect is powerful. It makes the narrative feel durable, like it was always there, just dormant. And durability creates legitimacy in the public mind. If something keeps coming back, people assume there must be a reason. Even if that reason is momentum itself. Another shift happens here. Curiosity turns into vigilance. Audiences don't just consume these stories anymore, they watch for signs. They anticipate developments. They scan for inconsistencies. The story becomes a lens through which other stories are judged. That's when it stops being entertainment and starts becoming orientation. At this stage, even absence becomes meaningful. If someone isn't mentioned, people ask why. If a story doesn't resurface, people wonder what's being withheld. Silence becomes suspicious. Normality becomes questionable. This is the environment the narrative now lives in. And within that environment, names like Ellen, Epstein, and Diddy don't need new material to remain relevant. Their association with the framework is enough. Each mention reinforces the pattern. Each pattern reinforces belief. What's dangerous about this phase isn't that people are asking questions. Questioning is healthy. What's dangerous is when questioning no longer requires answers to feel satisfied. When the act of questioning becomes the endpoint. Because at that point, resolution doesn't matter. The story doesn't need to conclude. It only needs to continue. It survives on anticipation rather than outcome, and anticipation is endlessly renewable. This is why the narrative feels alive. It adapts, it absorbs, it expands. It doesn't collapse under scrutiny because scrutiny is part of its fuel. The more people examine it, the more layers appear. Not necessarily because there are layers to uncover, but because the framework allows them to exist. And once people operate within that framework long enough, it shapes how they interpret the world beyond this story. New controversies feel familiar. New figures feel suspect. New narratives feel incomplete by default. That's the broader impact. This story isn't just about three names. It's about how modern audiences process power, how trust is given, how it's withdrawn, and how difficult it is to restore once it's gone. And as long as those conditions remain, skepticism, delayed accountability, and fragmented information, stories like this won't disappear. They'll evolve, they'll migrate, they'll attach themselves to new contexts. Because in the end, the darkest part of the story isn't any single claim. It's the realization that once trust erodes at scale, every story that follows inherits that damage. As the narrative reaches this stage, something important becomes clear. It no longer depends on new revelations to survive. It depends on memory, on association, on how certain names now trigger a reaction before they trigger a question. Ellen, Epstein, Diddy. Each one carries a different history, but together they now activate the same instinct in the audience. The instinct to doubt surfaces and look for what lies underneath. What people are really responding to isn't a single allegation or a single unresolved mystery. It's the growing awareness that systems don't announce themselves while they're operating. They reveal themselves later, often slowly, often accidentally, through cracks rather than collapses, a resurfaced clip, a delayed legal action, a cultural reckoning that arrives years after the moment has passed. By the time the public understands the shape of what happened, the moment itself is already gone. That delay creates something powerful, mistrust mixed with curiosity. People begin scanning the past differently, not to relive it but to reevaluate it. Hindsight turns into investigation. Familiar moments feel foreign. Neutral actions feel intentional. Silence feels calculated. And in that environment, innocence no longer feels like a default state. It feels like something that must be demonstrated. This doesn't mean conclusions are accurate. It means the ground has shifted. And that shift doesn't reverse easily. Once audiences internalize the idea that power often protects itself quietly, every future story gets filtered through that assumption. New controversies don't feel isolated. They feel like extensions. New figures don't feel unique. They feel like variations of a known pattern. The question stops being what happened and becomes, where have we seen this before? That's why stories like this don't end cleanly. They don't wrap up with a verdict in the public imagination. Even when courts move on or headlines fade, the narrative lingers. It resurfaces in discussions. It gets referenced in new contexts. It becomes a shorthand for something larger, a symbol rather than a report. And symbols are hard to dismantle. Because symbols aren't built from facts alone. They're built from emotion, repetition, and timing, from the way information arrives late, from the way accountability feels selective, from the way silence stretches just long enough to let speculation take root. This is where the story truly becomes darker, not because of what's proven, but because of what feels plausible. The audience doesn't need certainty anymore. Plausibility is enough. The sense that something like this could happen becomes indistinguishable from belief that it did. And once that line blurs, correction loses its power. Even clear explanations feel incomplete. Even transparency feels reactive. That's the long-term consequence of erosion of trust. It's also why these narratives spread beyond the people at their center. Once the framework exists, it applies everywhere. To other industries, other figures, other institutions, the audience carries it forward. Every new story is tested against it. Every new silence is weighed. Every delay is interpreted. And that framework becomes self-reinforcing. Because when people expect hidden layers, they find them. Not necessarily because they're there, but because interpretation fills gaps faster than facts ever could. In that environment, speculation doesn't feel reckless, it feels protective, like vigilance, like learning from the past. That's why disengagement doesn't happen. People don't walk away from stories that make them feel informed, even if that information is incomplete. They return to them, they revisit them, they use them as reference points to understand the present. And that's what ultimately keeps stories like this alive. Not outrage, not shock, but the sense that this is how the world actually works. Whether or not these specific names are ever formally connected by evidence becomes almost secondary. The cultural shift has already occurred. Audiences now assume that proximity matters, that access matters, that silence matters, and that waiting years for clarity doesn't undo the impact of what happened in the meantime. That understanding changes how power is viewed permanently. So when people say this story keeps getting darker, they're not just reacting to information. They're reacting to the realization that certainty is rare, accountability is often delayed, and appearances are more fragile than they once believed. And once that realization sets in, it doesn't stay contained to one story. It spreads. In the end, what remains isn't a conclusion. It's a question that keeps resurfacing in different forms. How many things felt normal at the time that only looked disturbing in retrospect? And how many of those moments are still sitting quietly in plain sight, waiting for context to change? That question is what keeps people watching. It's what keeps them searching. And it's why stories like this don't disappear, they evolve. If you've stayed all the way through, you already understand this isn't about panic or accusations. It's about patterns. And once you start seeing patterns, you don't stop seeing them. So I'll leave you with this. Do you think these recurring names are connected purely by coincidence and timing, or do they reveal something deeper about how power moves when no one is looking? Share your perspective in the comments. And if you want to stay ahead of narratives like this as they continue to unfold, make sure you're subscribed because the quiet parts of these stories are often the ones that matter most.